iron gates of Blackwood Penitentiary loomed before me like the maw of some ancient beast, its teeth rusted with the blood of 1,000 condemned souls. February wind whipped across the yard, carrying ice crystals that stung my face through the thin prison-issued jacket. I wasn't meant to be here, not really. One mistake, a desperate grab for something better, and now I traded my cramped downtown apartment for an even smaller cell, the intake process stripped away more than just my clothes and possessions. Each mechanical step, the fingerprinting, the mug shots, the delousing shower that burned my skin, peeled away another layer of my identity until I was nothing more than a number. 47,891. Move it, Lawrence, the guard barked, shoving me forward with his baton. My new name was James Lawrence, convicted of grand larceny and sentenced to 5 years. The name felt foreign on my tongue, like clothes that didn't quite fit. But that was the point of witness protection, to become someone else entirely. Someone who hadn't seen Marcus Delac empty 3 rounds into a rival gang member's chest. Someone who hadn't testified in a closed courtroom, hands shaking. I pointed to the man who'd promised to make me watch my family burn. I shuffled down the corridor, the echoes of my footsteps bouncing off walls that had witnessed nearly a century of human suffering. Cell Block D was housed in the oldest wing of Blackwood, a Gothic revival structure that looked more like a medieval monastery than a modern prison. The guard stopped at cell 213, his keys jingling in the lock like funeral bells. "Home, sweet home," he sneered, pushing me inside. "Meet your new roommate." My eyes traveled upward to the top bunk, where a figure lay motionless as a corpse. He didn't turn to look at me, didn't acknowledge my presence in any way, just stared at the ceiling with unblinking eyes set deep in a gaunt face. "That's Hayes," the guard said, his voice dropping slightly. "Been here 8 years. Doesn't talk much or at all, really. Keeps to himself. You do the same, and you might make it through your sentence in peace." The cell door clanged shut with horrible finality. I stood awkwardly in the middle of our shared space, 6 by 8 feet of concrete and steel that would be my world for the next 5 years. The lower bunk was bare, a thin mattress waiting for standard issue sheets and blankets. A stainless steel toilet sink combination unit occupied one corner, offering the illusion of privacy with a half-height partition. A small desk bolted to the wall completed the austere furnishings. Hello," I ventured, glancing up at my silent cellmate. "I'm James." Hayes didn't move, didn't blink, didn't give any indication he'd heard me. His chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, the only sign he was alive at all. He was older than me, probably in his 50s, with gray-streaked hair cropped close to his skull. Prison pallor had turned his skin an unhealthy shade of yellow-white, like old newspaper. I began making my bed with the supplies I'd been issued, trying to ignore the oppressive silence from above. The sheets were rough against my fingers, the blanket thin and already pilling. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, though every time I looked up, Hayes was in exactly the same position, eyes fixed on the ceiling. Night fell early in February, darkness seeping through the high window like black ink through water. The cell block settled into its nighttime routine guards, making their rounds, inmates calling out to each other, the occasional clash of metal on metal. I lay on my bunk, staring into the darkness, listening to the strange symphony of prison life. Sleep came eventually, dragging me under like a riptide. And with it came the first dream. I found myself in an alley I'd never seen before, yet knew intimately. Brick walls rose on either side, their surfaces slick with something that glistened in the dim light. The air hung thick and stagnant, carrying the metallic tang of approaching rain. My feet moved forward without my permission, each step echoing off the narrow walls. A street lamp flickered ahead, its light struggling against the darkness like a dying firefly. Beneath it stood a woman in a red skirt that seemed to absorb the light, the fabric moving slightly though there was no wind. Her back was to me, head bowed as if in prayer. Something about her posture made my skin crawl, too still, too perfect, like a mannequin, positioned by unseen hands. I tried to stop walking, tried to turn, tried to run, but my body continued its inexorable march forward, a puppet on invisible strings. The woman's head began to turn, so slowly I could hear the creak of tendons. My throat closed up, voice trapped behind a wall of terror. A child appeared at the far end of the alley, a small boy in a yellow raincoat. He couldn't have been more than 6 or 7. His face was blurred, indistinct, but I could feel his innocence like a physical presence in the air. He took a step toward us, pudgy hand reaching out. No, I tried to scream, but no sound emerged. My vocal cords strained against the silence, threatening to snap from the effort. The woman's arm rose with mechanical precision, moonlight glinting off the blade in her hand. The boy kept walking forward, unaware or uncaring of the danger. I thrashed against my invisible bonds as the woman's face finally came into view. Where features should have been, there was only smooth, blank skin like a department store mannequin. The knife descended in a graceful arc. I jerked awake, sweat-soaked sheets twisted around my legs. The cell was pitch black, except for the faint glow of security lights filtering through the window. Above me, Hayes's breathing remained steady and shallow. Undisturbed by my violent awakening, my heart hammered against my ribs as I tried to orient myself. Just a dream. A vivid, horrifying dream, but nothing more. I'd had nightmares before, who wouldn't, after what I'd witnessed. But this had felt different, more real, more orchestrated. I lay awake until dawn, listening to the sounds of the prison at night. Somewhere down the block, an inmate sobbed in his sleep. Guards' boots clicked on concrete during their rounds. And above me, Hayes remained absolutely silent, as if he'd mastered the art of breathing without making a sound. The next day passed in a blur of new routines. Breakfast in the cafeteria, where I learned to keep my eyes on my tray and my mouth shut. A meeting with my assigned counselor, Dr. Sarah Chen, who seemed more interested in her clipboard than my responses to her questions. Then work assignment laundry duty, sorting through endless piles of identical orange jumpsuits. Your Lawrence, Right, the new guy. A voice startled me from my mechanical folding. The speaker was a Hevis, Ed man with tattoos crawling up his neck like ivy. His name tag read Rodriguez. Yeah, I answered cautiously, remembering the guard's advice about keeping to myself. Rodriguez glanced around before leaning closer. Heard you got put in with Hayes. Man, that's rough. Why? What's his story? Nobody knows for sure. Been here longer than most of us. Never says a word, never causes trouble. But he hesitated, checking again to make sure no guards were within earshot. People who sell with Hayes, they don't last long. Either they go crazy, begging for transfers, or what? Or they don't wake up. Rodriguez shrugged, turning back to his work. Just something to think about, new guy. That night, the dream came again. This time, the alley was longer, the darkness thicker. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, brick and mortar breathing in sync with my racing heart. The woman in red was there again, but now I could see others watching from the shadows. Figures with blank faces, heads tilted at impossible angles. They lined the alley like silent sentinels, mannequin hands clasped in front of them as if in anticipation. The boy in the yellow raincoat appeared, but this time he spoke. His voice echoed oddly, as if coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Are you here to watch too? He asked, staring past me with eyes that had no color. They always watch. Every night, they watch. I wanted to warn him, to grab him and run. But my body remained frozen. The woman's knife caught the light differently now. The blade seemed longer, curved like a crescent moon. As she raised it, I noticed something that sent ice through my veins. A prison tattoo on her wrist. The same identification number I'd seen on Hayes's intake form. The knife fell. I woke gasping, my throat raw as if I'd been screaming. But that was impossible. I hadn't made a sound. I couldn't have. Above me, Hayes lay motionless, but somehow I knew. He wasn't asleep. The darkness between our bunks felt charged, alive with unspoken things. During yard time the next day, I approached one of the older guards, Officer Martinez. He'd been kind enough to show me where to find extra soap my first day, and something about his weathered face suggested he might be willing to talk. Officer, I said quietly, what do you know about Hayes? Martinez's expression tightened. Why do you ask? Just curious about my cell. Mate, he never talks. That's because he can't. Martinez glanced around before continuing. Story goes, he did it to himself. Took a razor blade to his own vocal cords before they caught him. Never found out why. What was he in for? Above my pay grade, kid. His files sealed came from some other facility up north. But he paused, choosing his words carefully. There's something not right about that one. Had 3 cellmates my first year here. First one hung himself. Second had some kind of breakdown, kept talking about dreams. Third one, he shook his head. Just watch yourself. Back in my cell that evening, I found myself studying Hayes with new eyes. He lay in his usual position, corpse still, staring at nothing. But there was something about the angle of his head, the tension in his shoulders. He knew I was watching him. And somehow, I felt he was pleased about it that night. I tried not to sleep. I counted ceiling cracks, recited old poems, anything to keep my mind active. But exhaustion won out eventually, and I slipped into darkness. This time, the alley was different. The walls were covered in writing, thousands of words scratched into the brick. As I drew close, I realized they were all the same phrase repeated endlessly. Watch with me. Watch with me. Watch with me. The woman in red turned fully toward me for the first time. Where her blank face had been, there was now something worse, my own features, twisted into an expression of ecstatic cruelty. The knife in her hand was no longer a knife, but a straight razor, its edge wet with possibility. You understand yet? She asked in Hayes's voice. Why I chose you, the boy in the low raincoat appeared, but now he wore an orange prison jumpsuit. He looked up at me with Hayes's eyes. Your turn to watch, he said. Your turn to be silent. I jerked awake to find myself standing in the middle of the cell. My hand was pressed against my throat, fingers probing as if searching for a wound. The skin was intact, but I could still feel the phantom kiss of the razor's edge. A sound from above made me freeze, a wet, clicking noise, like someone trying to speak without a tongue. Hayes had turned onto his side, facing the wall, but in the dim light I could see his shoulders shaking with silent laughter. The next morning, I went to see Dr. Chen. Dark circles ringed her eyes, and she seemed distracted, shuffling through papers without really seeing them. Dr. Chen, I said, I need to know about Hayes. She stiffened slightly. Mr. Lawrence, I can't discuss other inmates' cases, please. I haven't slept properly in days. These dreams, I hesitate. I think they're killing me. She looked up sharply. Dreams about a woman in red, and a child, and watching. Always watching. The color drained from her face. She stood abruptly, walked to her filing cabinet, and pulled out a thick folder. Her hands trembled as she opened it. 3 months ago, another inmate came to me with similar dreams. Jonathan Miller. He was Hayes's previous cellmate. She pulled out a series of drawings, crude crayon sketches of a woman in red, a child in yellow, faceless figures watching from shadows. He made these during our sessions. Said Hayes was sharing something with him through the dreams. What happened to him? Found dead in his cell. Officially ruled a suicide. She swallowed hard. He'd cut his own throat. But before that, he wrote something on the wall in his blood. Now I understand the silence. I felt the room tilt sideways. Hayes, what was his original crime? Dr. Chen's voice dropped to a whisper. He was a psychiatrist at a children's hospital in Vermont. 7 children disappeared over 2 years. They never found the bodies, but they found videos. Hayes filming himself, watching as a female accomplice. She couldn't finish. The woman in red, I breathed. They never caught her. Hayes was arrested after the 8th child disappeared, but he'd already, she gestured to her throat. The videos showed him just watching, never participating, never speaking, just watching with this horrible pleasure. The walls seemed to be closing in. Why wasn't I told? Why put anyone in a cell with him? Budget cuts, overcrowding, politics. She shook her head. I've filed reports, but nobody listens. And Hayes, he's a model prisoner. Never causes trouble, just watches and dreams. That night, I lay in my bunk, heart pounding. pounding so hard I was sure Hayes could hear it. The silence from above felt heavier than ever, pregnant with malevolent intention. Just before midnight, I heard it, that wet, clicking sound again. Then words spoken in a voice like graveyard soil. Time to watch again, James. Time to learn the beauty of silence. The dream, when it came, was different. I wasn't in the alley anymore. I was in a hospital, a room, sterile and white. Hayes stood by a child's bed, camera in hand, and beside him stood a nurse in a crisp white uniform, her red skirt visible beneath the hem. She turned, and I saw my own face again, but younger, feminine, my sister Rachel, who had disappeared 15 years ago while working at Burlington Memorial Children's Hospital. The pieces clicked into place with horrible clarity. The familiar way she moved in my dreams, the sense that I should know her. Hayes hadn't chosen me randomly. Somehow, he'd known who I really was, known why witness protection had seemed like an acceptable alternative to prison. In the dream, Rachel/not Rachel smiled at me with too many teeth. Remember when we used to play hospital, Danny? You were always such a good patient, so quiet, so still. I hadn't heard my real name, Danny Mitchell, in over a year. The sound of it made my skin crawl. Hayes moved to stand behind her, his camera whirring softly. Your sister was beautiful, he said in that horrible clicking voice. She understood the art of observation, the poetry of silence, but she made one mistake. He reached up to touch his throat, where a thick scar was visible. She talked. The scene shifted. We were in the hospital basement now. Rachel stood over a small figure on a gurney, straight razor in hand. Hayes filmed everything, his breath coming in short, excited gasps. No, I tried to say, but no sound came out. Just like in every dream, yes, Hayes whispered. Watch with me, Danny. Watch what your sister became. Watch what you'll become. I thrashed against the dream's hold, feeling something tear in my mind. The basement dissolved into the alley, then back to the hospital, then to places worse than both, a kaleidoscope of horror with Hayes always at its center, always watching, always filming through it all. I heard Rachel's voice. Join us, little brother, in the silence, in the watching. I woke screaming, actually screaming this time, to find Hayes standing over my bunk. His eyes reflected the faint light like a cat's, and his mouth worked soundlessly, showing the mangled ruin where his tongue should have been. In his hand was a straight razor. Choose, he mouthed. Watch or join. The razor's edge caught the light, promising either silence or freedom. In that moment, I understood why his other cellmates had chosen the blade. The dreams would never stop. The watching would never stop. Unless the razor hovered between us like a silver pendulum, marking the seconds of my choice. Hayes's eyes burned with patient hunger. He had all the time in the world. He'd done this dance before, worn down stronger men than me with his dreams, his silence, his terrible gift for observation. Why me? I managed to whisper. Why now? He placed his free hand against his throat, then pointed at me. Slowly, deliberately, he mouthed words I could somehow understand. Because you're already half silent. Witness protection. False name. Hidden life. One step away from becoming no one. The worst part was, He wasn't wrong. James Lawrence was a fiction. Danny Mitchell was a ghost. And somewhere in between, I was disappearing. The dreams hadn't created my silence, they'd just revealed it. Hayes's lips moved again. Your sister understood. She learned to watch, to appreciate the artistry of suffering. But then she wanted to tell, to spoil the purity of observation with words. He touched the scar on his throat. I helped her find true silence. Now I'll help you. A memory surfaced Rachel at Christmas, the last time I saw her. Something odd about her smile, her eyes. She tried to tell me something, but the words wouldn't come. Had she been fighting Hayes's influence? Even then, the razor moved closer. Hayes's expression was almost gentle, like a teacher encouraging a struggling student. Above us, the ceiling stretched into darkness, and I could swear I saw faces watching from the shadows, all his previous students, all those who had chosen silence over sanity. I thought about Dr. Chen's file, about Jonathan Miller writing his last message in blood, about all the others who had occupied this bunk before me, dreaming Hayes's dreams until they couldn't bear it anymore. We were all connected now, links in a chain of observed suffering. The blade touched my throat, featherlight. Hayes's eyes glowed with triumph. He knew what choice his cellmates always made in the end. The dreams were too powerful, the silence too seductive. Better to become part of the watching than to remain the watched. But as the metal kissed my skin, I heard something else, a small voice, clear as a bell, cutting through the shadows in my mind. The boy in the yellow raincoat, no longer afraid. You don't have to watch. You don't have to be silent. You can scream. So I did.